The music stopped the moment Duke Alistair Farrow pointed his finger across the ballroom and said the words that would change everything. He called Lady Vivian Ashcombe the other woman, loud enough for every guest near the tall gold mirrors to hear him clearly. The candles seemed to flicker with the shock of it. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 200 eyes turned toward the young woman standing near the marble staircase in a soft blue gown, her gloved hands frozen at her sides. Vivian did not cry. She did not gasp. She simply looked at him, this man she had once respected, and let a small, steady smile settle on her lips. It was not the smile of someone who had been caught. It was the smile of someone who understood, in that single terrible instant, exactly what kind of man he truly was. She turned, lifted the hem of her gown, and walked toward the doors. Her steps were slow and graceful, as though she were leaving a dance rather than fleeing an accusation. Whispers chased her like a cold wind. Behind her, Duke Alistair stood with his jaw tight and his chest rising fast, certain he had done the right thing, certain that Lady Constance Whitmore, his cousin, had told him the truth only minutes before. Constance had come to him near the refreshment table, her voice trembling with false worry. She told him that Vivian had been seen slipping into his private study late at night, that she had been overheard speaking with intimacy to someone believed to be his own betrothed's former suitor. She had painted a picture so vivid, so wounding, that Alistair had not paused to ask a single question. He had simply walked across the ballroom floor and let his anger speak for him. Now, watching Vivian disappear through the tall doors without a single tear, something cold moved through his stomach. A whisper of doubt, but pride held him still, and he did not follow her. Outside, the night air was sharp and clean against Vivian's flushed cheeks. Her carriage waited at the bottom of the stone steps, the horses shifting restlessly in the dark. She climbed inside without help, arranging her skirts with hands that shook only slightly now that no one could see her. The door clicked shut. The wheels began to turn. She did not look back at the golden windows of the house glowing behind her. She had learned long ago that looking back only made the leaving harder. Her real reason for visiting the Duke's study 3 nights earlier had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with duty. Alistair's aunt, Lady Beatrice, had summoned her quietly, urgently, asking for help with a private family matter involving the estate's failing finances and a debt that threatened to disgrace the entire household if it became known. Vivian, who had managed her own family's modest accounts since her father's illness 2 years before, was one of the few people in society trusted with numbers and discretion in equal measure. She had gone to the study only to review documents Lady Beatrice had hidden from her nephew, hoping to find a solution before scandal arrived at his door. She had told no one. Lady Beatrice had begged her to keep it secret, fearing Alistair's pride would not survive knowing his family needed rescuing by outside hands. Vivian had agreed, never imagining her silence would one day be twisted into something shameful. The carriage rattled down the dark road toward her family home, a modest but proud house on the edge of the county, far smaller than the grand estates of the ton but warm in its own quiet way. Her brother, Henry Ashcombe, met her at the door, still in his evening coat, his face falling the instant he saw her expression. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing that matters anymore," she answered, and walked past him into the hall. She did not sleep that night. She sat by her window watching the moon move slowly across the sky, replaying the moment again and again, not with sadness but with a strange, clarifying anger. She thought of every kindness she had shown Lady Beatrice, every late evening spent bent over columns of numbers by candlelight, every secret she had kept out of loyalty, and she thought of how quickly a man she barely knew had chosen to believe the worst of her, without asking a single question. By morning, her decision had already formed itself quietly in her chest. She would not go back. Not to the balls, not to the drawing rooms, not to the endless performances of politeness that hid so much cruelty beneath silk and lace. She had given society enough of herself. Now she would give her time to something that could not betray her the way people did. Henry found her at breakfast, calm and composed, sorting through a stack of letters that had already begun arriving. Invitations, apologies from a few kind acquaintances, and one letter, unopened, bearing the wax seal of the Farrow family crest. She did not touch it. She placed it beneath the others and continued eating as though it did not exist. Across the county, in the grand and now much quieter halls of Farrow Manor, Alistair sat alone in his study long after the guests had gone home. The fire had burned low, and he stared into the embers with the same tight expression he had worn when he pointed his finger across the ballroom. But the certainty that had fueled him only hours earlier was beginning to crack, thin lines spreading through it like ice under too much weight. He thought of Vivian's smile, not an angry smile, not a frightened one, a smile that seemed to say she already knew something he did not. He called for his aunt the next morning, expecting comfort, expecting agreement that he had done right by protecting his family's name. Instead, Lady Beatrice arrived pale and trembling, refusing at first to meet his eyes. When he pressed her, asking directly what she knew of Vivian's visits to the house, she said only that it was not what he believed, and then excused herself from the room before he could ask anything further. The unease in his chest grew heavier. Meanwhile, word of the incident spread through the county faster than any carriage could travel. By afternoon, 3 separate households had already discussed it over tea, each version more dramatic than the last. Some said Vivian had been caught in the Duke's arms. Others said she had confessed everything and fled in shame. The truth, quiet and simple as it was, could not compete with the excitement of a scandal freshly born. Constance, for her part, played her role with practiced skill. She appeared devastated on Vivian's behalf whenever anyone asked, shaking her head and saying she could hardly believe such a respectable young woman could fall so low. Each performance drew her closer to the sympathy, and closer still to Alistair, exactly as she had planned from the very beginning. But plans built on lies rarely stand as steady as their makers hope. At the Ashcombe house, Vivian spent the following days in quiet, useful work. She helped Henry review the estate ledgers, corresponded with a distant relative about a small inheritance dispute, and walked each morning through the gardens behind their home, breathing air that did not carry the perfume of pretense. She refused every invitation that arrived, and there were many, some out of genuine concern, others out of curiosity dressed as kindness. One evening, as she sat by the window with a book unread in her lap, Henry knocked gently and stepped inside. "You do not have to hide forever," he said. "I am not hiding," Vivian replied. "I am choosing." Henry sat across from her, studying her face in the candlelight. "There is a difference between choosing peace and running from pain," he said carefully. Vivian closed her book. "Perhaps," she said, "but I would rather stand quietly on my own ground than dance again in a room that turned against me without asking why." Henry did not argue further. He had seen his sister endure grief before, when their father first fell ill, and he recognized this same steady strength in her now, the kind that did not need an audience to prove itself real. Far away, in the halls of Farrow Manor, Alistair finally opened the door to his aunt's private study, the very room where the truth had been hidden from him. Among the papers Lady Beatrice had not yet cleared away, he found a ledger in Vivian's careful handwriting, columns of numbers organized with quiet precision, notes in the margins suggesting solutions to debts he had not even known existed. He sat down slowly, the weight of understanding pressing against his chest like a stone. She had not been meeting anyone for romance. She had been trying to save his family from ruin, quietly, without asking for credit or reward, and he had repaid her with public humiliation in front of everyone whose opinion mattered most in their world. The fire in the hearth cracked softly, and Alistair sat motionless, staring at the evidence of his own terrible mistake, the first true crack forming in the wall of pride he had built so carelessly the night before. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the great house, as though even the weather sensed that something had shifted, and that nothing between the Duke and the woman he had wronged would ever be simple again. Later that same evening, Constance arrived at Farrow Manor uninvited, carrying a basket of sweetbread as an excuse for her visit. She found Alistair still in the study, the ledger open before him, and her smile faltered for the first time since the ball. "Is something troubling you, cousin?" she asked, keeping her voice light. He did not look up right away. When he finally did, his eyes were sharper than she expected, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle he suspects has been rearranged on purpose. "Tell me again what you saw," he said quietly. "Tell me exactly, word for word, what you told me at the ball." Constance hesitated only a moment, but a moment was enough. She repeated her story, and this time small inconsistencies slipped through the cracks of her careful performance, details that did not match what she had said only 2 nights before. Alistair noticed each one, though he said nothing yet, filing them away like a man gathering evidence before he was ready to use it. After she left, he sat alone once more, turning the pages of the ledger, tracing Vivian's neat handwriting with something close to shame. He thought of how easily he had trusted a familiar voice over an unfamiliar truth, how quickly he had chosen comfort over patience. He thought too of the calm way she had smiled at him before walking away, and he began to understand that her composure had not been weakness at all. It had been the quiet dignity of someone who refused to let cruelty define her, even when it came from a man whose good opinion she might once have valued. That understanding did not comfort him, It only deepened the ache of what he had done, and the growing certainty that an apology, however sincere, might never be enough to undo the damage of a single careless accusation, spoken in front of the entire world he lived in. A week passed, and Lady Vivian Ashcombe had not been seen at a single gathering in the county, not even the small ones where attendance was almost expected out of politeness. Her absence became louder than any words she could have spoken. In the drawing rooms of the Tun, her name was mentioned in careful, hushed tones, as though speaking too loudly might summon the scandal back to life. Some said she had fled to the coast in shame. Others insisted she had been sent away by her own family to avoid further embarrassment. None of it was true, but truth had never been required for a story to spread through polite society. All it needed was a spark and enough bored people willing to fan it into flame. At the Ashcombe estate, life continued in a rhythm far quieter than the one Vivian had known before. She rose early, walked the gardens while the dew still clung to the grass, and spent her afternoons helping Henry manage the accounts that kept their modest household steady. The work grounded her. Numbers did not gossip, numbers did not smile sweetly while planting lies. Yet even in her quiet corner of the county, she could not fully escape the reach of what had happened. A letter arrived from a distant aunt, gently suggesting that perhaps a period away from society, perhaps a visit to relatives in another county, might allow the talk to settle before it touched the family's name too deeply. Vivian read the letter twice, then folded it and set it aside without answering. She would not run from a lie by hiding herself away as though she were the one who had done wrong. It was during this quiet week that Lord Edmund Hale first called upon the Ashcombe household. He was a neighboring gentleman of good standing, known throughout the county for his fair dealings and his patient manner, a man who had inherited his family's land 2 years earlier and managed it with quiet competence rather than showy display. He arrived not with gossip on his lips but with a simple request to discuss a shared boundary dispute between their two properties, a matter that had lingered unresolved since before Vivian's father had fallen ill. Their meeting in the drawing room was brief and businesslike at first. Edmund laid out maps and old surveys across the table, speaking with a calm respect that Vivian had not received from anyone outside her own family in many days. When their discussion turned briefly to the recent scandal, as such things inevitably did in a county so small, Edmund said something that surprised her. "I do not believe everything I hear at balls," he said simply, folding one of the maps closed. "Half of it is invented before the musicians finish their first song." Vivian studied him for a long moment, searching for the polite falseness she had come to expect from nearly everyone since the incident. She found none, only a steady, unhurried honesty that asked nothing of her in return. "Thank you," she said quietly, and meant it more than she expected to. Their business concluded within the hour, but Edmund lingered a few minutes longer than necessary, asking about her father's health, about Henry's management of the estate, about ordinary things that had nothing to do with scandal at all. It was a small kindness, but it settled something restless inside her chest that had not been still since the night of the ball. Meanwhile, at Farrow Manor, Duke Alistair Farrow could not settle at all. The ledger he had found in his aunt's study haunted him more with each passing day. He confronted Lady Beatrice again, more firmly this time, refusing to accept vague answers or nervous silence. "Tell me the truth," he said, standing before her in the same study where the evidence had first surfaced. "All of it." Lady Beatrice finally relented, her hands trembling as she spoke. She confessed that the estate had fallen quietly into debt over the past 2 years, the result of poor investments made before Alistair had taken full control of the family's affairs. Fearing his pride would suffer if he learned the family required outside help, she had sought a solution in secret, and Vivian, known for her sharp mind with numbers and her absolute discretion, had agreed to help without asking for anything beyond the satisfaction of solving the problem quietly. Every visit to the house, every late evening spent in the study, had been in service of protecting Alistair's family name, not destroying it. Alistair sat in silence for a long time after his aunt finished speaking. The full weight of what he had done settled over him like a physical thing, pressing against his chest until it became difficult to breathe evenly. He had accused an innocent woman of the worst kind of dishonor, in front of everyone who mattered in their world, based entirely on the word of a cousin whose motives he had never once questioned. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" he finally asked, his voice rough. Lady Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. "I did not think anyone would speak so cruelly to her before I had the chance," she admitted. "I never imagined Constance would twist something so honorable into something so shameful." The mention of Constance's name settled like a stone in Alistair's stomach. He thought back to the ball, to the way his cousin had approached him with wide, worried eyes. to the careful way she had chosen her words to strike exactly where they would cause the most damage. He thought of the small inconsistencies he had noticed when he questioned her again days later, details that had shifted and changed each time she repeated her story. He rose from his chair with new purpose, though he did not yet know precisely what he intended to do with it. Over the following days, Alistair moved carefully, gathering pieces of the truth the way a man collects fragments of a broken vase, hoping to see the full shape of what had happened before he tried to repair anything. He spoke quietly with the household staff, who had seen Vivian's visits and could confirm their purpose. He reviewed correspondence between his aunt and Vivian that proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that their meetings had concerned nothing but estate finances and family concern. Each piece of evidence deepened his guilt and his resolve in equal measure. Constance, unaware of how quickly her careful lie was unraveling, continued playing her role in society with practiced grace. At a small gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance, she spoke sympathetically of Vivian's absence, suggesting in gentle tones that perhaps the poor girl simply could not face society after such an embarrassment. Around her, heads nodded in agreement, and no one thought to question a woman who appeared so genuinely concerned. But not everyone in the room was so easily convinced. Lord Edmund Hale, seated near the edge of the gathering, listened to Constance's performance with a quiet, careful attention. He had spent enough time in Vivian's company over the past week to recognize the difference between quiet dignity and hidden shame, and what he had seen in her did not match the picture Constance painted so eagerly. He said nothing that evening, choosing instead to watch and wait, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it would not take long before it grew into something more. At the Ashcombe estate, Vivian received Edmund's second visit with less surprise than the first. He arrived this time with no boundary dispute to discuss, only a small gift of fresh flowers from his own garden, and an offer to walk with her through the grounds if she wished for company. She accepted, and they spent nearly an hour walking beneath the autumn trees, speaking of small, ordinary things that carried no weight of scandal or suspicion. For the first time since the night of the ball, Vivian felt something like ease settle over her shoulders. Edmund did not treat her as a fallen woman requiring rescue, nor as a curiosity to be examined for signs of guilt. He treated her simply as herself, and in doing so, he offered her something she had not realized she desperately needed. As the sun began to lower over the fields, Edmund walked her back toward the house, his manner as steady and unhurried as it had been from the start. "Whatever happened at that ball," he said quietly, "I do not believe it was the whole truth. And I do not think you owe anyone an explanation until they have earned the right to ask for one." Vivian looked at him for a long moment, surprised by how deeply his words settled into her chest.
"Thank you,"
she said again, and this time her voice carried a warmth that had been absent since the night everything changed. That evening, as she sat by her window watching the last light fade over the fields, Vivian allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a future that did not revolve around the ballroom where her name had been so publicly stained. A future built on quiet respect rather than public spectacle. A future that did not require anyone's forgiveness for a wrong she had never committed. Miles away, in the study at Farrow Manor, Alistair stood before a mirror, straightening his coat with hands that were not quite steady. He had made his decision. He would go to her, not with excuses, not with careful arguments meant to soften his own guilt, but with the plain and difficult truth of what he had done, and what he now understood. Whether she would receive him at all remained uncertain. But for the first time since the night of the ball, Alistair understood that some mistakes could not be undone with silence, and that the only path forward, however painful, ran directly through the door of the woman he had wronged. Before he could act on that decision, however, a message arrived from Lady Beatrice asking him to wait. She feared that if Alistair approached Vivian too soon, without proof strong enough to silence any remaining doubt, Constance would find some new way to twist the situation further. Reluctantly, Alistair agreed to gather more evidence first, though every day of delay felt like another day of unforgivable silence. He began with the household staff who had attended the ball itself, asking careful questions about what they had witnessed in the hours before the accusation. One young footman recalled seeing Constance speak urgently with another guest earlier that evening, a conversation that ended the moment Alistair approached, as though it had been cut short on purpose. A housemaid remembered Constance requesting details about Vivian's recent visits days before the ball, questions that seemed unusually specific for someone claiming only passing concern. None of it was proof enough to present publicly, but together, the small details formed a pattern that Alistair could no longer ignore. He also wrote quietly to a former school friend, now a respected barrister in London, describing the situation without revealing names, asking simply how a man might go about proving that a public accusation had been based on a deliberate falsehood. The response encouraged him to gather written correspondence where possible, since spoken testimony alone could easily be denied or reshaped later. Armed with this advice, Alistair returned to his aunt's study and reviewed every letter Lady Beatrice had exchanged with Vivian over the past several months. Each one confirmed what he already suspected. Vivian's tone throughout was professional, careful, and entirely focused on solving the estate's financial troubles. There was no hidden affection in her words, no suggestion of anything beyond genuine concern for a family she had chosen to help without expectation of reward. He copied the most relevant passages by hand, setting them carefully aside, though he still did not know how or when he might use them. Meanwhile, at the Ashcombe estate, Henry noticed the change in his sister almost immediately after Edmund's second visit. She hummed softly while sorting the Morning Post, something she had not done since before the ball. He said nothing about it at first, choosing instead to watch quietly as color slowly returned to her cheeks. "You seem lighter today," he finally remarked one evening as they sat together near the fire. Vivian glanced up from her book, a faint smile touching her lips. "Lord Hale has been kind," she admitted, "kinder than most." Henry studied her carefully. "Kind enough to matter?" he asked, though his tone remained gentle rather than teasing. Vivian considered the question honestly before answering. "Perhaps," she said, "though I am in no hurry to trust so quickly again." Henry nodded, understanding the caution behind her words better than most. "That is wise," he said, "but do not let one man's cruelty convince you that all kindness is false." Vivian turned the words over in her mind long after he had gone to bed. She thought of Edmund's steady patience, so different from the sharp, careless judgment she had faced at the ball, and she allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that perhaps not every man in her world was so quick to believe the worst. Yet even as her days grew brighter under Edmund's quiet attention, the shadow of the ball had not fully lifted. Word eventually reached her, through a cousin who still moved in society's circles, that Duke Alistair Farrow had been asking questions, gathering information, behaving in ways that suggested he no longer believed the story he himself had spoken aloud that terrible night. Vivian felt no relief at the news. If anything, a quiet anger stirred within her, sharper than before. It was not enough, she thought, for a man to quietly discover the truth in private while she continued to carry the public weight of his mistake. If he wished to undo the damage he had caused, he would need to do so as loudly and as publicly as he had caused it. She said nothing of this to Henry, nor to Edmund, keeping the thought close to her chest like a small, hard stone she was not yet ready to set down. Whatever Alistair intended to do next, she resolved that she would not simply wait quietly to be rescued from a reputation he alone had damaged. She would decide, on her own terms, whether his apology, however sincere, would be enough to matter at all. The letter arrived at Farrow Manor on a gray morning, sealed with wax that had been pressed carelessly, as though the sender had been in too great a hurry to be neat. Alistair broke it open at once, and his eyes moved quickly across the page. It was from a solicitor in London, a man who handled small disputes for families across several counties, and it concerned a debt Constance Whitmore had quietly incurred over the past year, one she had kept hidden from her own relatives out of pride and fear. Alistair read the letter twice before setting it down on his desk. The debt itself was not enormous, but the timing struck him at once. Constance had needed money badly in the weeks before the ball, and marrying well, perhaps to a duke himself, would have solved her difficulty far more easily than facing her creditors alone. He sat back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle sliding into place with uncomfortable clarity. Constance had not simply repeated a careless rumor out of concern. She had built it, carefully and deliberately, to remove Vivian from his life and clear a path toward securing her own future through marriage to him. The realization sat heavy in his chest, heavier even than the guilt he had carried since discovering the ledger in his aunt's study. He had not only wronged an innocent woman, he had allowed himself to be used as a weapon by someone he had trusted simply because she shared his blood. He called for his aunt again that same afternoon, showing her the solicitor's letter without a word. Lady Beatrice read it slowly, her hands trembling slightly as understanding dawned on her face. "She meant to trap you into marriage," Lady Beatrice said quietly, "and she was willing to destroy an innocent woman's name to do it." Alistair nodded grimly. "I intend to prove it," he said, not quietly, not in whispers behind closed doors. "If I destroyed Lady Vivian's reputation in front of the entire county, I will restore it in exactly the same place." Lady Beatrice studied her nephew for a long moment, seeing in him a resolve she had not witnessed since before his father's passing years earlier. "Be careful," she warned gently. "Constance will not surrender easily, and cornered creatures often become the most dangerous. Her warning proved wiser than either of them realized. That same evening, word reached Constance that Alistair had been asking pointed questions among the household staff, that he had written to a solicitor in London, that his manner toward her had grown cool and distant in recent days. Panic set in quickly beneath her composed exterior. She understood, with the sharp instinct of someone who had built her entire plan on deception, that the walls around her were beginning to close. Rather than retreat, she decided to strike first. The following morning, Constance called upon several prominent households across the county, spreading a new and more dangerous version of events. She suggested, with practiced sorrow, that Vivian had not only pursued an improper relationship with the Duke, but had also attempted to manipulate his aunt into signing over control of family finances, hinting darkly at fraud and deceit far beyond a simple scandal of the heart. The rumor spread faster than the first, carrying with it an edge of real danger. Where the original accusation had merely damaged Vivian's social standing, this new version threatened her family's honor, and even hinted at legal consequence. Henry heard the whispers within a day, his face darkening with an anger Vivian had rarely seen in her usually calm brother. "They are trying to ruin us entirely," he said, pacing the length of the drawing room. "This is no longer gossip, this is an attack." Vivian remained remarkably still as she listened, though her mind moved quickly beneath her composed exterior. She recognized immediately the greater danger in this new lie, understanding that whoever had spread it intended not merely to embarrass her, but to destroy any possibility of her family's continued standing in the county. "We must respond carefully," she said finally. "Panic will only make us appear guilty." Henry stopped his pacing and looked at his sister with something close to admiration. "How can you remain so calm?" he asked. "Because I have already lost my place in society once this month," Vivian answered simply. "I refuse to lose my dignity along with it." That same afternoon, Lord Edmund Hale arrived at the Ashcombe estate, his expression grave. He had heard the new rumors circulating through the county, and had come immediately, not to question Vivian but to offer whatever assistance he could provide. "I do not believe a word of it," he said firmly, the moment he was shown into the drawing room. "But I fear this new lie carries teeth the first one lacked. If it continues to spread unchecked, it could reach beyond mere gossip." Vivian appreciated his directness more than any gentle comfort could have offered. "What would you suggest?" she asked. Edmund considered the question carefully before answering. "Silence protected you once," he said. "But silence against an accusation of fraud may not serve you as well. Sometimes the only way to stop a lie from growing is to meet it directly, with evidence rather than composure alone." His words echoed something Vivian had already begun to suspect. She had grown wary of remaining passive, of allowing her fate to be decided entirely by whispers she could not control. Perhaps the time had come to take a more active hand in defending herself, rather than simply enduring whatever society chose to believe. Meanwhile, at Farrow Manor, Alistair moved with growing urgency once he learned of the new and more dangerous rumor spreading through the county. He understood immediately that Constance had grown desperate, and that desperation made her both more dangerous and more careless. If she continued escalating her lies, sooner or later she would make a mistake large enough to expose herself entirely. He confronted her directly that evening, requesting she attend him privately in his study, the same room where the truth had first begun to surface. Constance arrived with her usual composed smile, though something flickered nervously behind her eyes as she took her seat across from him. "You wish to speak with me, cousin," she said lightly. Alistair did not return her smile. "I know about the debt," he said plainly. "I know you needed money badly enough to consider marriage as your only escape, and I believe you invented a story about Lady Vivian in order to remove her from consideration and clear your own path toward securing my hand instead." Constance's composure cracked visibly for the first time since the ball. She opened her mouth to deny it, but the words seemed to catch somewhere in her throat as she realized how much he already knew. "That is a serious accusation," she finally managed, her voice thinner than before. "Not nearly as serious as the one you convinced me to make in front of the entire county," Alistair replied coldly. "I have letters, I have witnesses, and I have a solicitor's confirmation of your financial difficulty in the weeks before the ball. The only question remaining is whether you will admit the truth quietly now, or whether I will be forced to expose it publicly along with everything else you have done." Constance sat frozen for a long moment, calculating desperately behind her frightened eyes. Finally, something in her seemed to collapse inward, the careful mask slipping away to reveal the fear that had driven her actions from the very beginning. "I did not mean for it to go so far," she whispered. "I only wanted a chance at security. My family's finances have always been so much smaller than yours, and I feared what would become of me if I did not secure a good marriage soon. That fear does not excuse destroying an innocent woman's reputation, Alistair said, though his voice softened slightly at the genuine distress in her confession. You had other paths available to you. You chose the cruelest one. Constance's shoulders trembled, though whether from genuine remorse or simple fear of consequence, Alistair could not entirely tell. What will you do? She asked quietly. Alistair considered the question for a long moment before answering. You will write a full confession, detailing exactly what you did and why, he said finally. I will decide how and when to use it based on how the situation unfolds. But know this clearly. If you attempt to spread even one more word against Lady Vivian's name, I will make certain the entire county learns the truth about you before the week is finished. Constance nodded slowly, defeated, and left the study without another word. Alone once more, Alistair allowed himself a small measure of relief, though it did little to ease the deeper guilt still resting heavily in his chest. Exposing Constance's lies would help restore Vivian's reputation, but it would not undo the pain of that first terrible accusation, spoken aloud in front of everyone whose opinion mattered most in their world. Words, once released into a crowded room, could not simply be called back and forgotten. He spent the following days quietly working to correct the damage already done, speaking individually with families across the county, presenting careful evidence of Vivian's true role in helping his aunt manage the estate's finances. He did not seek credit for himself in these conversations, nor did he ask for sympathy regarding his own mistake. He simply presented the truth as plainly as possible, and allowed each family to draw their own conclusions. Slowly, carefully, the tide of opinion within the county began to shift. At the Ashcombe estate, Vivian noticed the change before she understood its cause. Fewer whispers reached her ears through Henry's careful reporting. A few families who had avoided any contact since the scandal began, sending polite inquiries after her health. Small gestures that suggested the harshest edge of judgment had begun to soften. She remained cautious, unwilling to trust the shift entirely until she understood where it had come from. When Henry finally learned, through a conversation with a mutual acquaintance, that Alistair himself had been working quietly to correct the record, Vivian received the news with a complicated mixture of feelings she could not easily untangle. Part of her wanted to dismiss it entirely, to insist that his quiet efforts changed nothing about the cruelty of that first public accusation. Another part of her, quieter and more honest, recognized the difficulty and courage required to admit fault so openly, especially for a man of his position and pride. She said nothing of these thoughts to Henry, nor to Edmund, though she found herself, late at night, staring at the letter Alistair had sent weeks earlier, still unopened, still resting beneath a stack of other correspondence she had chosen not to read. Perhaps, she thought finally, the time had come to learn what he wished to say, not because she owed him the chance, but because she owed herself the certainty of knowing exactly what kind of apology, if any, a man like Alistair Farrow was capable of offering. She broke the seal that night, her hand steady despite the uncertainty pressing against her chest, and began to read the words he had written in the days immediately following the ball, long before he had gathered any proof of Constance's deception, written instead from the raw and uncertain place of a man beginning, for the first time, to doubt his own judgment. The letter did not attempt to excuse what he had done. He wrote plainly of the shame he felt each time he remembered the sound of his own voice cutting across the crowded room, of the way her calm smile had haunted him in the days that followed, more unsettling than any tears could have been. He confessed that he had not yet earned the right to ask her forgiveness, and that he did not expect it, only that he wished her to know how deeply he understood the size of his error, even before he had gathered proof of who had truly caused it. Vivian read the letter twice, then set it carefully on her writing desk and stared out at the darkened garden beyond her window for a long while. She had expected excuses, perhaps even a subtle attempt to shift some blame onto Constance's shoulders alone. Instead, she found only plain acknowledgement of his own failure, written without flourish or performance, in the private hours when no one stood watching to judge whether his remorse looked convincing enough. It did not erase what he had done. It did not return to her the weeks of quiet suffering, the whispered judgments, the careful avoidance of neighbors who had once greeted her warmly, but it shifted something in her understanding of him, softening the hard edge of anger just enough to let a more complicated feeling settle in its place. The next morning she mentioned nothing of the letter to Henry, though he noticed a change in her manner over breakfast, a thoughtfulness that had not been present the day before. When Edmund called later that afternoon, bringing with him news that Constance's confession had finally begun circulating quietly among the county's most influential families, Vivian listened carefully, weighing his words against the private knowledge she now carried of Alistair's own hand in uncovering the truth. "It seems the Duke has been busy correcting his mistake," Edmund observed, watching her reaction carefully as he spoke. "So it seems," Vivienne replied, offering nothing further. Edmund did not press the matter, though something in his expression suggested he had noticed the careful neutrality in her tone, so different from the sharper anger she had carried in the days immediately following the scandal. He remained a steady, comfortable presence throughout the visit, asking after her garden, sharing small stories from his own estate, offering the same easy companionship that had brought her such quiet comfort in recent weeks. Yet even as she enjoyed his company, a small, persistent thought lingered at the edge of her mind, one she could not quite set aside. Somewhere across the county, a man who had wronged her deeply was working, quietly and without seeking credit, to undo the damage his careless words had caused. She did not yet know what she felt about that fact, only that it refused to leave her thoughts entirely alone. That evening, after Edmund had gone and Henry had retired for the night, Vivienne sat once more at her writing desk, a blank sheet of paper before her, an inkwell open and waiting. She held the pen for a long while without writing anything at all, uncertain whether a reply was owed, or wise, or even possible given everything that had passed between them. Finally, she wrote only a few lines, brief and careful, neither forgiving him fully nor closing the door on the possibility entirely. She thanked him for the honesty in his letter and told him plainly that words, however sincere, could not undo what had already been done in front of so many witnesses. If he wished for anything more than her acknowledgement of his effort, he would need to prove it through action, not merely through private confession offered in the safety of ink and paper. She sealed the letter before she could reconsider, setting it aside to be sent the following morning, and allowed herself, for the first time since the ball, to sleep through the night without the familiar weight of anger pressing against her chest. Across the county, when Alistair received her brief reply several days later, he read it standing in his study, the same room where so much of the truth had already come to light. Her words were measured and careful, offering no easy forgiveness, demanding instead the kind of proof that only time and action could provide. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of his desk, beside the confession Constance had finally written and signed under his firm insistence. 2 documents, both born from the same terrible night, each one marking a different kind of reckoning still unfolding across the county. Whatever came next, Alistair understood clearly now that Vivienne's trust would not be won through words alone, however carefully chosen. It would require something far more difficult, a willingness to face her directly, to accept whatever judgment she chose to offer, and to prove through steady action that his understanding of his own failure ran deeper than a single letter could ever express. 3 weeks after the ball, Duke Alistair Farrow's carriage rolled to a stop outside the modest gates of the Ashcombe estate. He stepped down without waiting for his footman, his boots landing on the gravel path with a determination he had not felt in years. He had rehearsed his words a dozen times during the ride, and every version now felt hollow the moment the house came into view. Henry Ashcombe met him at the door before he could even raise his hand to knock, arms crossed, expression cold. "You have some nerve coming here," Henry said flatly. "I know," Alistair replied. "I do not ask for welcome. I ask only for a few minutes to speak with your sister." Henry studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in the Duke's tired eyes against the memory of Vivienne's pale face the night she had come home from that terrible ball. Finally, he stepped aside, though his expression remained guarded. "She may refuse you," he warned, "and if she does, you will leave without argument." Alistair nodded once, accepting the condition without hesitation. Inside, Vivienne stood near the drawing-room window, having heard the carriage arrive and recognized the crest upon its door. Her heart beat unevenly, though her face remained composed by long practice. When Henry appeared to tell her who waited below, she did not move for a long moment, weighing the letter she had already sent him, the careful words she had chosen, against the reality of facing him now in person. "Tell him I am not receiving visitors today," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. Henry relayed the message plainly, without softening it, and Alistair accepted the refusal with a quiet nod, though disappointment flickered clearly across his face. He did not argue, true to his word, but before turning to leave, he asked Henry a single question. "Will you at least tell her that I understand," he said, "that I do not expect forgiveness, that I only wish for the chance to make right what I broke, in whatever way she deems fit?" Henry studied him carefully, surprised by the humility in a man he had expected to find full of excuses. "I will tell her," he said finally. Alistair returned to his carriage and rode away without further protest, leaving behind a quiet uncertainty that lingered in the house long after the sound of his wheels had faded down the road. That evening, Henry relayed the exchange to his sister exactly as it had happened, watching her expression carefully as he spoke. Vivian listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though something in her eyes suggested she was turning his words over carefully in her mind. "He came all this way only to be turned away," she said finally, almost to herself. "He did not seem surprised by it," Henry replied. Nor did he seem angry, only determined. Vivian said nothing further that evening, retreating early to her room with more questions than answers weighing on her thoughts. She had expected some satisfaction in refusing him, some sense of justice restored after the humiliation she had endured. Instead, she found only a strange, unsettled restlessness that followed her long after she had blown out her candle. Over the following days, Alistair did not attempt another visit, though word of his continued efforts to correct the scandal reached the Ashcombe household through various channels. He had begun quietly compensating several tradesmen and families who had suffered financial losses connected to Constance's earlier debts, working to ensure that no innocent party bore consequence for his cousin's desperate scheming. He had also arranged, through careful and private conversation, for Constance to be sent to live with distant relatives in the north, far from the county where her reputation could no longer be salvaged, though he stopped short of exposing her publicly, choosing instead a quieter form of justice that spared his own family further scandal, while still ensuring she faced real consequence. Vivian learned of these efforts gradually, piece by piece, through Henry's careful reporting and occasional mention from Edmund, who continued his regular visits with the same steady warmth he had shown from the beginning. She found herself listening more closely each time Alistair's name arose in conversation, though she was careful never to let her interest show too plainly. One afternoon, while walking the garden path with Edmund, she finally allowed herself to speak more openly about her uncertainty. "I do not know what to make of it," she admitted, watching the late autumn leaves drift across the grass. "Part of me wishes to hold on to my anger. It has kept me steady these past weeks." Edmund considered her words thoughtfully before responding. "Anger can be a useful shield," he said, "but it makes a poor companion for a lifetime. Perhaps the question is not whether you should forgive him, but whether continuing to carry this anger serves you, or only weighs you down further." Vivian walked in silence for a while, considering his words carefully. "You speak as though you have no stake in the answer," she said finally, glancing sideways at him. Edmund's expression remained calm, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes. "I have enjoyed our friendship greatly these past weeks," he said honestly. "Whatever you decide regarding the Duke, I hope it does not mean the end of our own acquaintance." His honesty touched her more than any grand declaration could have. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being patient with me, and for never once asking me to be anyone other than exactly who I am." They continued their walk in comfortable silence, the earlier tension easing into something gentler, though the question of Alistair remained unresolved between them. Meanwhile, at Farrow Manor, Alistair received word that a formal gathering was being planned by several of the county's most prominent families, an event intended partly to celebrate the arrival of the harvest season, and partly, though no one said it aloud, to mark the county's collective return to normalcy after weeks of scandal and uncertainty. He recognized immediately the opportunity such an event might offer, though he understood equally well that any attempt to force reconciliation would only push Vivian further away. He spent several days deliberating over what action, if any, might prove his sincerity beyond further letters or private visits she was not yet ready to receive. Finally, he settled upon a plan that required patience above all else, a willingness to let his actions speak fully before ever asking again for the chance to speak with her directly. He began quietly assisting Henry with certain estate matters that had grown difficult since their father's illness years earlier, offering practical knowledge and useful connections without ever mentioning Vivian directly, working instead through Henry alone, respecting the boundary that had been set so clearly during his first visit. Henry, though initially wary of the Duke's involvement, found himself gradually appreciating the genuine usefulness of the assistance offered, delivered always without condition or expectation of reward. Over several weeks, a cautious respect began forming between the two men, built not on grand gestures but on the steady accumulation of small, consistent honesty. One evening, as Henry reviewed a proposal Alistair had sent regarding a more efficient method of managing their tenant farms, he found himself speaking of it to Vivian almost without thinking. "He has been remarkably helpful," Henry admitted, setting the papers aside. "I did not expect that from him." Vivian looked up from her book, curiosity flickering across her expression despite her efforts to remain composed. "Helpful how?" she asked. Henry explained the assistance Alistair had quietly provided over recent weeks, careful to keep his tone neutral rather than persuasive, though he could not entirely hide his growing respect for the man's patient, consistent effort. Vivian listened closely, surprised by the picture forming before her, so different from the careless, prideful man who had pointed his finger across a crowded ballroom weeks earlier. "Perhaps people can change," she said quietly, almost to herself. Henry studied his sister carefully. "Perhaps," he agreed, "though only time will prove whether the change runs deep or shallow." That night, Vivian found herself once again at her writing desk, though this time she did not hesitate as long before beginning to write. She composed a short letter, careful and measured as before, informing Alistair that she had heard of his continued efforts through Henry, and that while she remained unwilling to receive him in person just yet, she no longer wished for him to believe his actions had gone entirely unnoticed. It was not forgiveness. It was not even a promise of eventual reconciliation, but it was, for the first time since the ball, an open door, where before there had only been silence, and when Alistair received the letter several days later, he understood immediately the significance of what she had offered him, however small it might have seemed to anyone else observing from the outside. He carried the letter with him for days afterward, rereading it often enough that the folded creases began to soften from handling. It changed nothing about the harvest gathering already being arranged by the county's leading families, but it changed everything about how he intended to approach it. He no longer needed to force a confrontation or beg for an audience he had not yet earned. He needed only to continue proving, steadily and without demand, that his understanding of his failure ran as deep as his words suggested. He turned his attention next toward the wider damage Constance's second, more dangerous rumor had caused. Though her confession remained largely private, shared only with the families whose good opinion mattered most, Alistair understood that whispers of fraud and financial impropriety could still linger in corners the confession had not yet reached. He spent an entire week visiting smaller households throughout the county personally, families of modest standing who rarely received a duke's direct attention, explaining plainly and without excuse that the accusations against Lady Vivian had been entirely false, born from his cousin's desperate scheming, rather than any fault of Vivian's own. Many of these families were surprised by his humility. A man of his rank rarely troubled himself to correct rumors involving people so far beneath his usual social circle, yet Alistair insisted on visiting each household personally, understanding that true repair required more than a single grand gesture aimed at impressing the county's most powerful families alone. Word of these quiet visits eventually reached Vivian as well, carried this time not through Henry but through a conversation she overheard between two tenant wives at the local market, women who had no reason to flatter a duke and no knowledge that Vivian stood close enough to hear their genuine surprise at his humility. "He came to our door himself," one woman remarked to the other, setting aside baskets of autumn vegetables, apologized plainly, without excuse, and made certain we understood the truth before he left. Vivian walked home that afternoon, turning the overheard conversation over carefully in her mind. It was one thing to hear of Alistair's efforts secondhand through Henry, who might reasonably be expected to soften an account out of growing friendship with the man. It was another thing entirely to overhear strangers, with nothing to gain from flattery, describing the same quiet humility unprompted. That evening, Edmund called again, finding Vivian more thoughtful than usual as they walked the garden path together beneath a sky heavy with the promise of early winter frost. He noticed her distraction almost immediately, though he did not press her to explain it. "You seem far away this evening," he observed gently. Vivian hesitated before answering honestly. "I am trying to understand what I believe," she admitted, "about forgiveness, and about whether a man's actions after wrongdoing can ever truly balance against the wrong itself." Edmund considered the question with his usual patience. "I do not think balance is quite the right measure," he said finally. "Wrongs done cannot be erased by rights done afterward, as though weighed on a simple scale. But perhaps what matters is not erasing the wrong, only proving through consistent action that the person who caused it has become someone unlikely to cause it again." His answer settled something uneasy in Vivian's chest, though it did not resolve the larger question still turning within her. She thanked him quietly for his honesty, grateful, as always, for his steady refusal to press her toward any particular conclusion. As the harvest gathering drew nearer, invitations began arriving at the Ashcombe household once more, this time without the careful, curious undertone that had marked earlier correspondence following the scandal. The county, it seemed, had largely accepted the truth of what had happened, and Vivian's name was spoken now with sympathy rather than suspicion. Henry watched his sister read each invitation with quiet satisfaction, relieved to see the slow restoration of a reputation that had never deserved damage in the first place. Vivian set the invitations aside without deciding immediately whether she would attend. The thought of returning to a ballroom, any ballroom, still carried the sharp memory of that terrible night, and she was not yet certain whether she possessed the courage to walk through such doors again, regardless of how much the county's opinion had shifted in her favor. She would need more time to decide, she told herself, folding the invitations carefully and setting them beneath the small stack of correspondence that had grown steadily since Alistair's quiet campaign of honesty began working its slow, patient repair across the county. The letter that finally broke Constance Whitmore's carefully guarded secret arrived not from Alistair, but from a solicitor in London who had grown suspicious of irregularities in her financial dealings months before the ball had ever taken place. Addressed directly to the head of the county's magistrate, the letter detailed a pattern of borrowed sums Constance had never repaid, debts owed to 3 separate households under false promises of eventual marriage settlements that never materialized. Word spread through the county within a single day, faster and more thoroughly than any rumor Constance herself had ever managed to spread. This time, there was no clever performance to soften the blow, no sorrowful expression to win sympathy from listening ears. The evidence was plain, written in careful legal language that left little room for doubt or interpretation. Alistair learned of the solicitor's letter the same morning it reached the magistrate, and though he had anticipated some form of exposure eventually, the suddenness of it still struck him with force. He had hoped to manage Constance's downfall quietly, sparing his family whatever remained of its dignity, but the wider scope of her deception, extending well beyond the lie told about Vivienne, meant the matter was no longer his alone to control. He rode immediately to Farrow Manor's smaller cottage, where Constance had been staying since her removal from the main household weeks earlier, and found her already aware of the letter's contents, her face pale and drawn in a manner that finally matched the desperation she had long concealed beneath practiced composure. "It is over," she said quietly as he entered, not bothering to rise from her chair by the window. "I cannot outrun this any longer." Alistair studied his cousin for a long moment, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction at her collapse, only a tired sadness for the family bond that had been so thoroughly broken by her choices. "You brought this upon yourself," he said, though his voice carried less anger than it once might have. "I know," Constance admitted, her earlier defiance entirely gone now. "I have known it for weeks, ever since you first confronted me in your study. I simply hoped, foolishly, that I might yet find some way to delay the reckoning." Alistair sat across from her, silent for a moment before speaking again. "What will you do now?" he asked. Constance shook her head slowly. "I do not know," she admitted. "Perhaps my relatives in the north will still take me in, though I imagine even they will hear of this eventually." Alistair offered no false comfort, understanding that whatever sympathy remained in his heart for his cousin could not undo the very real harm she had caused, nor shield her from the natural consequences of choices she alone had made. He rose to leave, pausing only briefly at the door. "I will not stand in the way of whatever justice the magistrate decides is fair," he said, "but I will also not add cruelty of my own to what you already face. You were family once, and though you broke that trust badly, I do not take pleasure in watching you fall this far." Constance said nothing further as he left, and within the week, arrangements were made for her removal from the county entirely, her name becoming, almost overnight, a cautionary tale whispered among the very same households where she had once spread her careful lies about Vivian. News of Constance's full exposure reached the Ashcombe household through multiple sources within a matter of days, each account slightly different in its details but consistent in its central truth. The woman who had destroyed Vivian's reputation at the ball had been exposed not merely as a jealous schemer, but as someone who had built an entire pattern of deception across the county, using desperation and clever performance to manipulate everyone around her. Vivian received the news with a complicated mixture of vindication and weariness. Part of her felt a fierce satisfaction at seeing the truth finally laid bare for all to witness, the same public exposure she had once wished upon the woman who had cost her so much. Yet another part of her, quieter and more tired, simply wished the entire affair had never begun at all, understanding that no amount of justice served upon Constance could fully return the weeks of pain she had endured. Henry brought her the fullest account that evening, having heard it directly from a neighbor who attended the magistrate's initial hearing. He described Constance's pale, defeated appearance, the careful legal language of the solicitor's letter, and the surprising restraint Alistair had shown throughout the entire proceeding, refusing to add any personal accusation beyond what the evidence already demonstrated plainly on its own. He could have humiliated her further, Henry observed. Many men in his position would have. Instead, he simply let the truth speak for itself. Vivian considered this quietly, recognizing in Alistair's restraint an echo of the same dignity she herself had tried to maintain the night of the ball, choosing composure over spectacle, even when spectacle might have felt satisfying in the moment. The recognition unsettled her slightly, forcing her to consider Alistair not merely as the man who had wronged her, but as someone capable of the same complicated mixture of failure and growth that marked every person she had ever truly respected. 2 days later, a formal letter arrived at the Ashcombe estate, this one different from Alistair's previous correspondence. Rather than an apology or an account of his continuing efforts, the letter contained a simple, direct request. He asked, with careful humility, whether Vivian might grant him a single meeting, in whatever setting and under whatever conditions she chose to name, so that he might finally offer his apology in person, rather than through the safe distance of written words. Vivian read the letter several times before setting it down, aware that this request marked a different kind of turning point than anything that had come before. A written apology could be composed carefully, revised until every word achieved its intended effect. A meeting in person offered no such protection, exposing both of them to whatever honest reaction the moment produced. She spent the following day considering her answer carefully, walking the garden paths alone despite the growing chill of approaching winter, weighing the anger she had carried for weeks against the slow, steady evidence of change she had witnessed in Alistair's actions since that terrible night. She thought of Edmund's patient counsel, of Henry's grudging respect, of the tenant wives who had spoken so genuinely of the Duke's unprompted humility during his visits to their modest homes. Finally, she made her decision, and that evening she wrote a brief reply, agreeing to meet him, though she specified carefully that the meeting would take place at the Ashcombe estate itself, in the presence of her brother, rather than anywhere that might expose her to the public eye before she had decided for herself what she truly felt. Alistair arrived 3 days later, this time received without hesitation at the door, though the household's atmosphere remained careful and formal rather than warm. Henry led him to the drawing room, where Vivian waited near the same window she had stood beside weeks earlier when she had first refused to see him. She turned as he entered, studying his face carefully, searching for any trace of the prideful certainty that had marked him the night of the ball. She found instead a tiredness in his eyes, a humility that had clearly cost him something significant to develop over the weeks since his careless accusation had first shattered her standing in society. "Thank you for receiving me," he said quietly, remaining near the doorway rather than approaching too closely. Vivian gestured toward a chair, and he sat, though he kept his posture straight and formal, clearly aware that whatever comfort he might once have taken for granted in her presence had not yet been restored. "I have rehearsed this apology many times," he began, "and yet every version feels inadequate now that I am finally before you. I was wrong, not simply wrong in believing Constance's lies, but wrong in the manner I chose to act upon them. I should have questioned her. I should have sought you out privately before ever speaking a single word in that crowded room. Instead, I let my pride and my anger speak before my reason had any chance to intervene, and I caused you a wound that words alone can never fully heal." Vivian listened without interrupting, her expression carefully composed, though something behind her eyes softened slightly as he spoke. When he finished, silence stretched between them for a long moment before she finally responded. "You caused real harm," she said plainly. "Not only to my reputation, but to my sense of safety within the very society I had always known. I do not offer forgiveness lightly, nor do I offer it simply because you have spent several weeks working diligently to correct your mistake. Diligence does not erase the wound. It only proves, perhaps, that the wound was not inflicted by a man entirely without conscience." Alistair accepted her words without argument, understanding that any attempt to soften them further would only undermine the honesty she deserved from him now. "I do not ask you to forgive me today," he said. "I ask only that you allow me to continue proving, through whatever time you are willing to grant, that the man who wronged you that night is not the whole of who I am." Vivian studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against everything she had witnessed and heard over the preceding weeks. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I am willing to allow that time," she said, "but I will not pretend the anger has vanished entirely, nor will I rush toward reconciliation, simply because doing so might prove convenient for either of us. Whatever trust is rebuilt between us will happen slowly, on my terms, and only if your actions continue to match the words you have spoken today." Alistair nodded, relief and gratitude mingling clearly across his tired features. "That is more than I hoped for, and exactly what I deserve to be asked of me," he said. Their meeting ended shortly afterward. formal and careful still, though something had shifted subtly in the space between them. A door that had been firmly closed now standing open, however narrowly, for the first time since the night everything had changed. As Alistair's carriage pulled away from the Ashcombe estate, Vivian watched from her window, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant or sorrowful. She did not yet know where the coming weeks would lead, whether the careful trust now beginning to rebuild between them would grow into something deeper, or whether it would remain simply a quiet peace between two people who had once caused each other significant pain. Whatever came next, she understood clearly that she alone would decide the pace and shape of it, no longer a woman defined by a single cruel accusation spoken in a crowded ballroom, but someone who had proven, through weeks of quiet dignity, that her worth had never depended on anyone else's judgment at all. That evening, Henry found his sister still seated near the window long after the last light had faded from the sky, her expression thoughtful rather than troubled. He hesitated before speaking, uncertain how deeply to press her about the meeting he had witnessed only in part, having excused himself briefly during the more private portions of their conversation, out of respect for whatever needed to pass between them. "How do you feel?" he asked finally, taking the chair across from her. Vivian considered the question honestly before answering. "Uncertain," she admitted, "but not unhappy. I think, for the first time since that night, I feel as though I am choosing my own path forward, rather than simply reacting to what has been done to me." Henry nodded slowly, understanding the significance of her words better than most. "That is no small thing," he said. "I have watched you carry this burden with more grace than I believe I could have managed in your place. Whatever you decide about the Duke, know that I trust your judgment completely." His words settled warmly in her chest, a reminder of the steady loyalty that had anchored her through the most difficult weeks of the entire ordeal. She reached across and squeezed his hand briefly, grateful beyond words for a brother who had never once doubted her, even when the rest of the county had been so quick to believe the worst. 2 days later, Edmund called upon the household as he often did, though this time Vivian found herself explaining the meeting with Alistair more openly than she had originally intended. She had considered keeping the matter private, uncertain how Edmund might receive the news, but her growing respect for his honesty demanded the same honesty in return. Edmund listened carefully as she described the conversation, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded, though a flicker of something quieter passed briefly behind his eyes before he spoke. "I suspected this might come," he said finally. "I have watched the county's opinion shift steadily these past weeks, and I have seen how carefully you have followed the Duke's efforts, even when you tried not to let it show." Vivian flushed slightly, surprised by how clearly he had read her thoughts despite her efforts at composure. "I did not mean to deceive you," she said quietly. "My feelings on the matter remain genuinely uncertain, even now." Edmund offered a small, understanding smile, though something wistful lingered beneath it. "You owe me no explanation," he said gently. "Our friendship was never built upon any promise beyond honesty and mutual respect, and I intend to honor that regardless of where your heart eventually settles. Whatever you decide, I hope you will always consider me a friend, even if circumstances lead you toward a different kind of future." His generosity in that moment touched her deeply, and she found herself grateful once again for the quiet steadiness he had offered throughout the most difficult weeks of her life, expecting nothing in return beyond simple honesty. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you have given me these past weeks, without ever once asking for anything beyond friendship." They spoke a while longer of ordinary matters, the tension of the earlier conversation easing gradually into the familiar comfort that had marked their friendship from its beginning, though both understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the shape of their acquaintance might soon shift into something quieter, a fond memory of kindness offered during a difficult season, rather than the foundation of a deeper future together. Meanwhile, the formal hearing regarding Constance's debts concluded within the week, the magistrate ruling that she must repay what remained possible of her outstanding obligations before relocating permanently to her distant relatives in the north, a quiet but final consequence for the deception that had caused so much unnecessary suffering. Alistair attended the proceedings only briefly, offering no further testimony beyond what had already been established through the solicitor's original letter, unwilling to add any personal cruelty to a judgment the evidence alone had already secured. In the weeks that followed, Alistair continued his careful, patient efforts to rebuild trust, visiting the Ashcombe estate periodically, always with Henry present, always respecting whatever boundaries Vivian set without complaint or pressure. Their conversations grew gradually longer and less formal, small moments of shared laughter occasionally breaking through the careful politeness that had marked their early meetings. though Vivian remained cautious about allowing herself to hope for too much too quickly. The county, meanwhile, watched the slow thaw between the Duke and the woman he had once wronged with quiet fascination, though this time the whispers carried a different tone entirely, curiosity mixed with genuine admiration for the dignity both had shown throughout the difficult months since the scandal first began. The harvest gathering approached steadily, and Vivian found herself, for the first time since the ball, genuinely considering whether she might finally be ready to step back into a crowded room without the fear that had kept her away for so long. The ballroom at Faro Manor blazed with candlelight, every chandelier lit, every window glowing warmly against the cold winter evening outside. Carriages lined the drive in greater number than the county had seen in months, and beneath the excited chatter of arriving guests ran a current of anticipation that had nothing to do with the harvest season the gathering officially celebrated. Word had spread quietly in the preceding days that Duke Alistair Faro intended to make some kind of announcement, though few guessed precisely what form it might take. Some assumed a new business venture. Others whispered of an engagement to some distant family he had not yet introduced to society. None imagined the truth, that the very ball where a young woman's reputation had been shattered months earlier would become the setting for its complete and public restoration. Vivian arrived later than most, her carriage rolling up the familiar drive with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She wore a gown of deep green silk, elegant but unadorned, chosen deliberately to avoid any appearance of trying too hard to impress a room that had once turned so quickly against her. Henry walked beside her as she climbed the stone steps, his presence a quiet anchor should the evening prove more difficult than she anticipated. "Are you certain about this?" he asked quietly as they approached the grand doors. Vivian paused only briefly before answering. "I am," she said. "I did not choose to leave that night in shame, and I will not enter tonight in fear either. Whatever happens, I intend to stand here on my own terms." Henry squeezed her hand gently and said nothing further, understanding that his sister needed no additional reassurance to carry her through whatever the evening held. Inside, the ballroom fell into a familiar hush the moment her presence was noticed near the entrance, though this time the silence carried curiosity rather than judgment, guests turning toward her with expressions ranging from genuine warmth to careful, watchful interest. Vivian moved through the room with quiet grace, greeting familiar faces, accepting polite conversation, refusing to let the weight of old memories pull her composure apart. Across the room, Alistair noticed her arrival immediately, his chest tightening with a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation. He had spent weeks preparing for this evening, rehearsing words that still felt inadequate no matter how many times he repeated them in the quiet of his own study. He allowed her time to settle into the room before finally crossing the polished floor to greet her properly. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to reach her without drawing unwanted attention from those nearby. "I did not come for you alone," she replied honestly, though a small, genuine smile touched her lips as she spoke. "I came because I decided this room no longer holds power over me." Alistair accepted her honesty with quiet respect, offering no argument, only a brief nod before stepping back to allow her the space she clearly still valued. The evening continued much as any other gathering might, music filling the hall, guests moving through familiar patterns of conversation and dance, though beneath the surface, everyone present understood that something significant was building toward its culmination as the night wore on. Near midnight, as the musicians paused between sets and guests gathered near the refreshment tables, Alistair signaled quietly to the small orchestra, requesting a brief silence before the next performance began. The room settled gradually, guests turning their attention toward the raised platform near the grand staircase, sensing that the moment many had anticipated all evening had finally arrived. Alistair climbed the few steps to the platform, his expression steady despite the nervous energy visible in the tight set of his shoulders. He looked out across the crowded room, finding Vivian's face among the guests, before he began to speak. "Many of you remember an evening several months ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "An evening when I stood in this very room and spoke words I had no right to speak, accusing an innocent woman of dishonor, based entirely on a lie I chose not to question, before I allowed my pride and my anger to do the speaking for me." A murmur passed through the crowd, guests exchanging glances as the weight of his words settled into the room. "I was wrong," Alistair continued, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the admission. "Lady Vivian Ashcombe did nothing to deserve the humiliation I caused her that night. She had, in fact, been quietly and selflessly helping my own family through a difficult financial matter, offering her time and skill without seeking any credit or reward. while I repaid her generosity with public cruelty born from a lie my own cousin invented out of desperate self-interest. He paused, allowing the words to settle fully before continuing, his gaze moving briefly toward his aunt, Lady Beatrice, standing near the edge of the room with tears already gathering in her eyes. I have spent these past months attempting, in whatever small ways I could manage, to correct the damage my careless words caused, he said. I do not stand here tonight seeking forgiveness for myself, though I hope, in time, it might be offered. I stand here because Lady Vivian deserves, in this very room where she was wronged, to hear the truth spoken as loudly and as publicly as the lie once was. He turned then, looking directly toward Vivian across the crowded hall, his voice softening slightly though it remained clear enough for every guest to hear. Lady Vivian Ashcombe is a woman of extraordinary integrity, kindness, and quiet strength, he said. She showed more grace in the face of cruelty than I have shown in my entire life before that night. Whatever future she chooses, whether it includes any place for me within it or not, she deserves the full and complete restoration of the respect this county owes her, and I intend to see that restoration honored, beginning here, tonight, in front of every person who witnessed her leave this room in dignity months ago. The hall remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, the weight of his public confession settling fully into every corner of the crowded room. Then, slowly, a ripple of quiet approval moved through the gathered guests, murmurs of respect replacing the earlier curiosity, several older members of the county's most respected families nodding with visible approval at the courage such a public admission required. Vivian stood motionless near the center of the room, every eye now turned toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to a moment so different from the one that had defined her months earlier. She felt Henry's steadying presence beside her, felt the warmth of Edmund's friendly nod from across the room, and felt, most surprisingly, a genuine and unexpected gratitude toward the man who had finally, fully, owned the wrong he had caused in front of everyone who needed to witness it. She walked forward slowly, the crowd parting naturally to allow her passage toward the platform where Alistair still stood, and the entire room watched in hushed anticipation as she stopped at the base of the steps, looking up at him with an expression that carried neither anger nor easy forgiveness, but something more complicated and more genuine than either. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for those nearby to hear, though she spoke primarily to him alone, not for the apology itself, though I am grateful for it, but for finally understanding that some wrongs require more than private correction. They require the same public honesty that caused the original harm. Alistair descended the steps to stand before her, close enough now that their conversation grew quieter, more private despite the many eyes still watching from across the room. "I do not expect anything more from you tonight than what you have already given," he said quietly. "But I hope, in time, you might allow me to prove through years rather than months, that the man who wronged you was not the whole truth of who I am capable of becoming." Vivian studied his face for a long moment, weighing his words against everything she had witnessed over the difficult months since that first terrible night. Finally, something in her expression softened, a small, genuine smile replacing the careful composure she had maintained throughout the evening. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like the chance to find out." A quiet warmth spread through the watching crowd as her words carried far enough for those nearby to understand their significance, though neither Vivian nor Alistair paid much attention to the room around them any longer, focused entirely on the fragile, hopeful understanding beginning to form between them. The musicians resumed their playing shortly afterward, and the ballroom gradually returned to its usual rhythm of conversation and dance, though an undercurrent of quiet satisfaction lingered throughout the remainder of the evening, guests sensing they had witnessed something rare, a genuine correction of injustice rather than the usual empty performances of polite society. Near the edge of the room, Edmund watched the exchange with a complicated mixture of feelings. Genuine happiness for Vivian's evident relief mingled with a quiet, private wistfulness for what might have been between them. When Vivian found him later in the evening, thanking him once again for his steady friendship throughout the most difficult months of her life, he accepted her gratitude with the same easy warmth that had marked their acquaintance from the very beginning. "You deserve happiness, whatever form it finally takes," he told her sincerely. "And I am glad, genuinely glad, to have known you during a season that asks so much of your strength." Vivian embraced the honesty of his words, grateful for a friendship that had never once demanded anything beyond simple kindness, understanding that some of the most valuable connections formed during difficult seasons did not need to become anything more than exactly what they already were. As the evening finally drew toward its close, Vivian stood near the same tall windows where she had once stood frozen in humiliation months earlier, though now the view outside carried none of the cold dread that had accompanied her hurried departure that terrible night. Alistair joined her quietly, standing beside her rather than crowding too close, both of them watching the winter stars scattered across the clear night sky beyond the glass. "I never imagined I would stand in this room again," she admitted softly, "let alone stand here feeling something close to peace." Alistair glanced sideways at her, his expression carrying quiet gratitude rather than triumph. "Neither did I imagine you would ever wish to," he replied honestly. "I am grateful beyond words that you found the courage to walk back through those doors tonight, on your own terms, exactly as you left them." Vivian turned to face him fully, her expression steady and clear in a way it had not been since long before the scandal first began. "This time," she said quietly, "I am not leaving because someone else decided my fate for me. Whatever happens next between us, I choose it freely, for myself alone." Alistair nodded slowly, understanding fully the significance of her words, and together they stood a while longer beside the tall windows, watching the winter night settle peacefully over the county, two people beginning, cautiously and honestly, to build something new from the wreckage of a single terrible night that had once threatened to define them both forever. Earlier that same evening, before the dancing resumed, Lady Beatrice had approached Vivian quietly near the edge of the refreshment tables, her eyes still damp from witnessing her nephew's public confession. She took both of Vivian's hands gently in her own, unable at first to find the right words for everything she wished to say. "I owe you an apology of my own," Lady Beatrice finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Had I spoken more plainly from the very beginning, had I trusted my nephew enough to tell him the truth before pride convinced me to hide it, none of this suffering would ever have touched you at all." Vivian shook her head gently, surprised by the older woman's evident distress. "You trusted me with something private," she said kindly. "That is not a fault deserving of apology. The fault belonged entirely to those who chose cruelty over patience that night, and I never once counted you among them." Lady Beatrice's eyes filled further at the generosity of the response, and she embraced Vivian warmly, a gesture that drew quiet, approving glances from several nearby guests who had known the family for years and understood the significance of such open affection between two women whose association had so recently been the very center of the county's cruelest gossip. Later, as the orchestra began a new set, Henry found himself approached by several gentlemen he had barely spoken with in the months since the scandal first broke, each offering quiet words of respect for the steady loyalty he had shown his sister throughout the entire difficult ordeal. He accepted their words graciously, though his attention remained mostly fixed across the room, watching Vivian move through the crowd with a lightness he had not seen in her step for many months. A young widow of modest fortune, seated near the edge of the dance floor, remarked to her companion that she could not recall the last time she had witnessed such a complete and satisfying restoration of justice within their small corner of society. Her companion agreed readily, adding that the Duke's willingness to humble himself so publicly, without excuse or self-pity, had earned him more genuine respect that evening than any grand display of wealth or status ever could have. Not every reaction in the room carried such warmth. A small cluster of guests who had once counted themselves among Constance's closest confidants stood near the far wall, exchanging uneasy glances throughout Alistair's speech, aware that their earlier eagerness to believe and repeat her lies now reflected poorly upon their own judgment. None of them approached Vivian directly that evening, though several sent quiet notes of apology to the Ashcombe household in the days that followed, unwilling to let the moment pass without at least some private acknowledgement of their earlier fault. As midnight passed and the gathering began gradually thinning, Edmund found a quiet moment to speak with Henry near the edge of the ballroom, the two men having grown into an easy, comfortable friendship over the difficult months since the scandal first began. "She looks happier tonight than I have seen her in a long while," Edmund observed, watching Vivian share a quiet laugh with Alistair near the tall windows across the room. Henry followed his gaze, nodding slowly. "She does," he agreed. "Though I suspect you played no small part in helping her find her footing again during the hardest weeks." Edmund offered a small, genuine smile, free of any lingering bitterness. "I only offered friendship," he said simply. "She found her own strength long before I ever arrived to witness it." The two men continued speaking a while longer, their conversation drifting toward lighter matters, the tenant farms and upcoming winter preparations that occupied so much of ordinary county life beyond the drama of ballrooms and scandal. It was, in its own quiet way, another small sign of how thoroughly the evening had shifted the atmosphere surrounding the entire Ashcombe family, from cautious suspicion, back toward genuine, comfortable belonging. By the time the last carriages began rolling away from Farrow Manor in the cold, clear night, Word of the evening's events had already begun spreading well beyond the walls of the ballroom itself, carried home by guests eager to share what they had witnessed with neighbors and family members who had not attended. By morning, the entire county would know not only that Duke Alistair Farrow had publicly confessed his terrible mistake, but that Lady Vivian Ashcombe had met his confession with the same quiet, unshakable dignity that had carried her through every difficult moment since the scandal first began months earlier. Spring arrived slowly that year, the frost lingering longer than usual across the fields surrounding the Ashcombe estate, though within the household itself, warmth had settled steadily since the night of the harvest gathering months earlier. Vivian rose each morning now without the heaviness that had once weighed on her chest, greeting the day with a lightness that Henry noticed and quietly cherished, having watched his sister carry so much difficulty with such steady grace throughout the preceding year. Alistair's visits had continued through the winter months, each one careful and respectful, never overstepping the boundaries Vivian had set that first difficult evening in her family's drawing room. He arrived usually in the late afternoon, often bringing small, thoughtful gifts that reflected genuine attention rather than empty gesture. A rare book on estate management he thought Henry might find useful. Fresh flowers from his own greenhouse during the coldest months when nothing grew easily elsewhere. Their conversations deepened gradually, moving beyond careful politeness into genuine friendship and then, slowly, into something warmer still. Vivian found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation she had not expected to feel again after the events of that terrible ball. And Alistair, for his part, approached each meeting with the same patient humility that had first begun rebuilding her trust the previous autumn. It was during one such visit, on a mild afternoon in early spring when the first green shoots had finally begun pushing through the thawing earth, that Alistair asked Henry for a private word before Vivian joined them in the garden. Henry listened carefully to what the Duke wished to discuss, and though he maintained a serious expression throughout the conversation, something like quiet satisfaction flickered behind his eyes by the time Alistair finished speaking. "You have my blessing," Henry said simply, extending his hand. "Though the final decision, as always, belongs entirely to my sister." Alistair accepted the handshake gratefully, understanding fully that Henry's approval, while meaningful, changed nothing about the far more important answer he still needed to seek from Vivian herself. He found her a short while later walking the same garden path where she had once confided her uncertainty to Edmund many months before, the early spring flowers just beginning to bloom along the worn stone edges. She smiled as he approached, a genuine warmth in her expression that would have seemed impossible to imagine during the darkest weeks following the scandal. "You seem nervous today," she observed, studying his careful manner with gentle curiosity. Alistair admitted as much with a small, honest laugh, the kind of unguarded response that had become more frequent between them as the months passed and old wounds slowly healed into something closer to trust. "I have something I wish to ask you," he said, "and I confess I have rehearsed the words nearly as many times as I once rehearsed my apology, though for entirely different reasons this time." Vivian's expression softened with understanding as he reached for her hand, and together they walked a little further along the garden path before he finally stopped beneath the bare branches of an old oak tree just beginning to bud with new spring growth. "I do not deserve a second chance after what I once did to you," he began quietly, "and yet you have given me one anyway, through months of patience I had no right to expect. I have watched you rebuild your life with more grace than I believed possible, and somewhere during these long months of proving myself worthy of your trust, I fell completely and irreversibly in love with you. Not despite the difficulty of our beginning, but perhaps because that difficulty taught me exactly what kind of woman you truly are." He knelt then, producing a simple ring from his coat pocket, one that had belonged to his mother years before her passing, chosen deliberately over anything more extravagant because he understood, by now, exactly what Vivian valued most. "Will you marry me?" he asked simply, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his expression. "Not because society expects it, and not because it would neatly resolve the scandal that once separated us, but because I genuinely cannot imagine building the rest of my life with anyone other than you beside me." Vivian looked down at him for a long, quiet moment, memories of that terrible night at the ball rising briefly before settling gently into the past where they belonged, no longer sharp enough to overshadow the genuine happiness building steadily within her chest. She thought of every careful step that had brought them to this moment, the anger and the patience, the quiet dignity and the slow, hard-won trust, and she understood with complete certainty exactly what her answer would be. "Yes," she said softly, and then again, more firmly, laughing gently through unexpected tears. "Yes, I will marry you." Alistair rose and drew her carefully into an embrace, the early spring sunlight breaking through the bare branches above them, and for a long moment neither spoke at all, simply grateful for the improbable journey that had led them from the depths of public humiliation to this quiet, private happiness beneath an old oak tree. Their engagement was announced formally within the month, and the county, having witnessed the entire painful and redemptive journey unfold across nearly a year, received the news with genuine warmth rather than the curious gossip that might once have accompanied such an announcement. Even those who had once whispered cruelly about Vivian now spoke openly of admiration for the strength she had shown throughout the ordeal, and of the rare and thoughtful courtship that had followed such a difficult beginning. Lady Beatrice, overjoyed at the news, insisted on hosting the wedding celebration herself, determined to see the final chapter of the story, written with the same warmth and honesty that had marked its slow, careful resolution. Edmund, true to the friendship he had offered so generously throughout the most difficult months, sent his sincere congratulations, along with a small, thoughtful gift for the new household, and attended the wedding itself with genuine happiness rather than any lingering bitterness, having found, in the months since, a growing fondness for a kind and sensible young woman from a neighboring county who suited his steady temperament perfectly. The wedding itself took place on a clear early summer morning, the small chapel near Farrow Manor filled with family and friends who had witnessed every painful and hopeful turn of the story since that terrible night at the ball nearly a year earlier. Henry walked his sister down the narrow aisle with quiet pride, no trace remaining of the protective anger he had once carried toward the man now waiting patiently at the altar. As Vivian exchanged her vows with Alistair, the golden morning light spilling gently through the chapel's tall windows, she found herself thinking not of the humiliation that had once threatened to define her entire future, but of the quiet strength she had discovered within herself throughout the long months that followed. She had walked away from that ballroom once with nothing but her dignity intact, uncertain whether she would ever find her place in society again, and she had returned to it eventually not as a woman rescued by anyone else's kindness, but as someone who had rebuilt her own life, on her own terms, before ever allowing love back into her heart. Alistair, watching her speak her vows with the same calm composure that had first struck him so powerfully the night he wronged her, understood more fully than ever exactly what he had nearly lost through his own careless pride, and exactly how fortunate he remained that she had chosen, despite everything, to give him the chance to become a better version of the man he wished to be. Their life together in the years that followed was not without its ordinary difficulties, the natural challenges that accompany any marriage built between two people who had learned the hard way the value of honesty and patience. But the foundation they had built together, forged through genuine accountability and earned trust rather than convenient forgiveness, proved steady enough to weather whatever ordinary storms life brought their way. Years later, when their own children asked about the old portrait hanging in the east hallway of Farrow Manor, the one depicting a young woman in a soft blue gown standing composed and dignified before a grand staircase, Vivian would tell them a simple, honest version of the story, not shying away from the difficult truth of how her marriage had begun, but emphasizing instead the deeper lesson she had carried with her ever since that terrible, transformative night. A person's worth, she would tell them gently, is never decided by the cruelty of others, no matter how loudly or publicly it is spoken. It is decided only by the quiet strength each person carries within themselves, and by their own steady choice, again and again, to walk forward with dignity rather than shame, regardless of what the crowded room around them chooses to believe. Alistair, listening nearby on those quiet evenings, would often add his own part of the story, one he never softened for the sake of pride. He told his children plainly that he had once let anger speak before reason, and that the cost of that single careless moment had nearly cost him the greatest happiness of his life. He wanted them to understand, clearly and without excuse, that a title or a position of power carried no protection against the damage careless words could cause, and that true strength lay not in never failing, but in having the courage to admit failure honestly and work patiently to repair it. Their eldest daughter, a thoughtful girl who had inherited her mother's steady composure, once asked why Vivian had chosen to forgive a man who had wronged her so publicly. Vivian considered the question carefully before answering, wanting her daughter to understand the true shape of what had happened, rather than a simplified version fit only for bedtime stories. "I did not forgive him quickly, or because he asked prettily," she explained. "I forgave him slowly, only after watching him prove through many months of quiet, consistent action that his sorrow was genuine and his change was real. Forgiveness offered too easily teaches people that words alone are enough. Real forgiveness, the kind worth giving, asks for more than words. It asks for time, and proof, and patience enough to see whether change is truly lasting." Her daughter nodded slowly, turning the lesson over in her young mind, and Vivian smiled softly, grateful that the difficult chapter of her own life had become, in the end, not a source of lingering bitterness but a genuine lesson in resilience she could pass on with honesty rather than regret. Lady Beatrice, who lived many more years within the walls of Faro Manor, often remarked to visiting guests that the portrait in the east hallway told only half the story. The other half, she would say with a knowing smile, lived on in the quiet warmth that filled the house each evening, in the laughter of children who had never known their mother as anything other than strong, respected, and deeply loved by everyone who called Faro Manor home. And so the story that had begun with a cruel accusation spoken across a crowded ballroom ended not in bitterness, but in a quiet, hard-won happiness built patiently over time, a reminder to everyone who ever heard it, told that dignity, once chosen and never abandoned, could carry a person through even the darkest and most public of storms, toward a peace entirely their own.